The United States dropped a freight train of tariffs directly onto Canada's most critical industries, and Mark Carney walked straight to a microphone and told Canadians this is simply a new reality they need to come to terms with. Interesting choice of words. Because everything appeared to be functional and manageable right up until the pressure actually arrived at the front door. Then suddenly the tone shifted completely. The language turned urgent and dramatic. And now, Prime Minister Carney is out here informing the Canadian public that the old relationship with the United States is fundamentally not what it once was. Funny how that realization only lands after the damage is already sitting on the table. Because this is not leadership responding to a crisis. This is a government reacting to a crisis it did not see coming and working very hard to make that reaction look like it was the strategy all along. Carney has now publicly stated that Canada's deep economic ties to the United States, once considered the country's greatest strength, have flipped into a structural weakness that must be corrected. Let that fully land before moving on. This is not a political commentator or an opposition critic making that claim. This is the sitting Prime Minister of Canada, the person directly responsible for managing one of the most consequential bilateral trade relationships on Earth. And he is now using language that signals a fundamental break. He went further and acknowledged that the entire economic model Canada built its prosperity on for decades has been reframed as a vulnerability by the man currently running the country. And somehow, that admission is supposed to inspire public confidence. That is exactly where the real problem becomes impossible to paper over. Carney said Canadians cannot simply hope the United States will return to normal. Hope isn't a plan and nostalgia is not a strategy, he stressed. Fine. But if your entire economic architecture was constructed around one single partner and that partner changes the rules overnight, what is the actual backup plan? Because what Carney is offering is not a plan. It is an instruction to adapt. Adapt to what, exactly? To watching the backbone of your export economy take simultaneous hits across multiple fronts with no immediate counter-strategy of equal force? Explaining a situation that has already moved beyond your control is not a leadership posture. It is a damage briefing dressed up as resolve. Now look at the actual tariff numbers sitting on the table, because this is where things stop being political commentary and become genuinely serious for real industries and real people. The dispute has led to sweeping tariffs on key sectors: steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, and other consumer goods, disrupting decades of cross-border economic cooperation. These are not minor trade friction points that businesses can quietly absorb and move past without breaking a sweat. These are direct precision hits landing simultaneously on the absolute backbone of the Canadian economy. Steel, aluminum, autos, and forestry are not peripheral industries, they are core. And the fact that all of them came under fire at roughly the same moment signals something deliberate, coordinated pressure applied across the broadest possible front. Carney keeps returning to the same phrase like a drumbeat. Violations of the trade deal, violations of the trade deal. He says it repeatedly and with genuine force. And here is the thing, he is technically correct. The tariffs do violate the existing agreement. But here is the follow-up question that never seems to get pushed all the way in his press conferences. So what? What actually changes the morning after you say that out loud? Because the tariffs are still there. The industries absorbing the damage are still absorbing it right now, in real time. Economic pressure does not pause, while Canada formally registers its objection through the correct diplomatic channels. Calling something a violation does not remove its impact. It simply confirms that the agreement is no longer protecting you, and that confirmation is its own separate crisis sitting directly on top of the first one. Then you start seeing the pattern that runs through this entire response. Carney knows the numbers. He states them out loud with emphasis. He clearly understands these are not symbolic gestures. They are real hits landing on real industries affecting real jobs in real communities. And yet, after acknowledging all of that, his response slides directly into calling them violations and then steering everything toward future discussions and future negotiations. There is a gap between the scale of the problem and the scale of the response that is genuinely difficult to look past. And then comes the line that tells you everything in one sentence. He admits Canada cannot control what its neighbor chooses to do. If you cannot control the decisions landing on 75% of your total exports, you are not negotiating from strength. You are managing from dependency. Then look at what has actually shown up as the most visible Canadian counter-response and try not to wince. Provincial liquor authorities pulling American alcohol off shelves. That is the move getting headline attention as Canada's pushback to heavy tariffs on its core industrial exports. Ontario's LCBO removed all U.S. alcohol from its shelves. Nova Scotia followed. Alberta halted purchases of American goods through its liquor authority. Steel and aluminum taking 50% hits, automobiles at 25%, forestry products absorbing sustained damage. And the response generating media coverage involves wine and whiskey bottles being cleared from government store displays. The imbalance between the problem and the countermove does not require additional commentary. It speaks entirely for itself. And Carney does not shut it down or replace it with something that actually matches the scale of pressure being applied. He lets it stand and routes everything else into a broader review framework. The tariffs are immediate. The damage is immediate. The response is delayed. This is where the frustration with how this situation is being managed becomes impossible to stay quiet about. Carney clearly grasps the severity of what is happening. He is using forceful language. He is acknowledging the dependency directly. He is calling out violations openly. The words coming out of those press conferences are strong. But when you go looking for actions that match those words, everything shifts into a much slower gear. Discussions, reviews, negotiations on a timeline measured in months, potentially years. Carney himself recently told CBC News that Canada and the U.S. could resolve the tariff dispute in a matter of days if Washington had the bandwidth and inclination to go through with it, but acknowledged it takes two sides to negotiate, and they are not all the way there. That timeline gap matters enormously because the industries sitting under those tariffs do not operate on a diplomatic review schedule. They feel the impact every single morning. Not in 6 to 8 months when the next framework produces another round of talks. Then comes the long-term trade diversification argument. Moving away from American dependency, cultivating new relationships with new partners, expanding Canada's reach across global markets. In April, Carney declared that the era of close economic integration and security cooperation with the United States has ended, calling on Canadians to fundamentally reimagine the economy and dramatically reduce dependence on the U.S. market. On paper, that direction is entirely correct. It genuinely is the right long-term move. But in practice, it is extraordinarily slow and deeply constrained by factors that no speech can dissolve overnight. Canada is physically connected to the United States. Supply chains on both sides of the border were built together over decades. Infrastructure was designed around that integration. Logistics networks were optimized specifically around that relationship. You cannot restructure any of that in a few months because tariffs arrived. Even economists who support the diversification strategy say this plainly. New trade agreements take years to form and even longer to generate actual results on the ground. The long-term solution points in the right direction, but runs on the wrong timeline for the immediate crisis sitting in front of everyone right now. What Carney is describing is not an answer to something that arrived this month. It is a long overdue correction to a structural vulnerability that should have been addressed years ago when the cost of addressing it would have been far lower. Describing it now as a response to the immediate tariff situation is like telling someone standing in a flooded house that the real solution is to build on higher ground. correct in theory, completely inadequate at the moment when the water is already at knee level. The framing choices Carney keeps reaching for, historical references, national unity language, appeals to Canadian resilience, tell you something specific about his own read of the situation. He knows this is not going to resolve quickly. He knows the pressure is going to be sustained. He knows that whatever emerges from the next round of negotiations will not land on Canada's preferred timeline. So he is borrowing the emotional vocabulary that helps people psychologically settle in for a longer fight. Fair enough as a communication strategy, but it raises a question that sits there uncomfortably through all of it. If the situation is genuinely serious enough to justify economic war language and national unity appeals, then why does the action still look like delayed negotiations and liquor store clearances? The federal government recently unveiled $1.5 billion in fresh relief measures for tariff-hit steel, aluminum, and copper industries. A real number, but one that functions more as a bridge than a solution. It is the government absorbing pain on behalf of industries, rather than removing the source of that pain. And that distinction matters. Then Carney starts citing favorable economic indicators. Canada is the second fastest growing economy in the G7. Canada holds the best fiscal position in the G7. Canada has been signing new deals with other partners. Those figures may well be accurate, but the timing of when they are being presented changes entirely how they land. Because when you introduce favorable statistics in the middle of a crisis that is actively unfolding, it does not project strength the way the speaker intends. It reads as deflection. It feels like an attempt to redirect the audience's attention away from the immediate problem toward a more comfortable set of numbers. And the immediate problem does not care what the G7 ranking says. A 50% tariff on steel is still exactly where it was before the statistics were cited. So let us bring the full picture together, because the pattern running through all of this is consistent, and it points in one clear direction. The United States is applying heavy, targeted pressure across multiple core Canadian industries simultaneously. Carney is naming it a violation. He is acknowledging the dependency. He is talking about adaptation and long-term diversification. He is framing the situation with language that signals seriousness, even conflict. And at the same time, he is highlighting positive economic data to keep public confidence from collapsing. All of those elements are present, and yet they do not add up to a clear, immediate response capable of producing results anywhere near the timeline on which the actual damage is operating. One side of this situation is moving fast, moving directly, and moving with obvious purpose. The other side is explaining, planning, reviewing, and negotiating. And the industries sitting right in the middle of those tariffs do not get to wait for the planning to catch up with the pressure. Canada's trade deficit with the United States has narrowed in recent months, and exports to countries other than the US jumped nearly 25% in March. A genuine early sign that diversification is beginning to take hold at the ground level. That is real. It matters. But it is the beginning of a decade-long structural adjustment, not a resolution to a crisis that is already live and accelerating. Here is where the entire situation lands when you step back and look at it honestly, without the press conference packaging around it. Canada is reacting, not leading, not shaping the outcome, reacting to decisions being made somewhere else, and working very hard to present that reaction as a controlled and confident strategic process. Carney is doing his best to project steadiness and long-term vision, and maybe some of those long-term moves will eventually produce something real. But right now, what the Canadian economy is experiencing is immediate, heavy, and still accelerating. The gap between that reality and the pace of the response is not closing, it is widening. One side of the border is moving with purpose and speed, the other side is still catching up. And the longer that gap stays open, the more it defines not just the trade relationship, but the entire perception of who holds the leverage and who is simply on the receiving end of it. That is where Canada stands today. And no amount of favorable G7 statistics or long-term diversification language changes what that picture actually looks like on the ground.